He wasn't a killer. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to shout orders or fire a gun to make men obey. Yet, when Frank Costello walked into a room, every gangster fell silent. In a world ruled by violence, one man rose above them all, not through fear, but through power. He controlled judges, police commissioners, and even whispered into the ears of senators. They called him the Prime Minister of the Underworld. While Lucky Luciano built the Mafia's empire and Al Capone drenched cities in blood, Costello mastered something far more dangerous: influence. With his words, he could move millions. With his smile, he could make politicians kneel. He turned the Mafia from street crime into an invisible empire that shaped American politics. But power like that never comes without enemies. And for Frank Costello, one bullet almost ended it all. This is the untold story of the man who ruled the Mafia without fear, without bloodshed, and without ever pulling a trigger. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the American Mafia. In the violent world of organized crime, most men fought for power with guns, knives, and blood. But Frank Costello was different. He understood something no one else did: that real power didn't come from bullets. It came from influence. While others built their empires through fear, Costello built his through respect. He wasn't the kind of man who kicked down doors. He was the one who made the rules behind them. To politicians, he was a friend. To mobsters, a kingmaker. To the FBI, an untouchable mystery. He came from nothing, a poor Italian immigrant kid in East Harlem, but his mind and manners would take him to the very top of America's underworld. When the Mafia needed legitimacy, he gave it structure. When they needed access to power, he handed them politicians. Frank Costello wasn't just another gangster. He was the man who transformed the Mafia from a street operation into a nationwide empire that reached the heart of American politics. But behind the charm and diplomacy was a dangerous truth. Every deal, every handshake came with a cost. And in the end, the man who controlled everything would have to fight for his own survival. This is the story of Frank Costello, the Mafia boss who ruled America without firing a single shot. Frank Costello's story begins in the rough immigrant neighborhoods of East Harlem, New York. He was born Francesco Castiglia in 1891, the son of poor Italian parents who came to America chasing a dream that never arrived. The streets he grew up on were ruled not by law, but by gangs. Every corner had its own crew, and survival wasn't about who was strongest. It was about who was smartest. Even as a young boy, Costello stood out. He didn't fight for scraps or get caught up in street brawls like the others. He watched. He learned. He understood that power was more than muscle. It was the ability to control others without them realizing it. By his teenage years, Costello was already part of the local gang scene, running small-time rackets and bootlegging. But unlike most street kids, he had a gift for communication. He knew how to talk to people, whether it was to charm a police officer, calm a rival, or persuade a judge. That talent became his weapon. While others intimidated with fists, Frank disarmed with words. He began to realize that influence could achieve what violence never could. It was a dangerous insight, but it would define his life. When Prohibition hit America in 1920, it changed everything. The government's decision to ban alcohol created the biggest business opportunity in the country's history. Suddenly, ordinary criminals became millionaires overnight, and the Mafia saw a future far beyond petty theft and gambling. Costello was quick to adapt. He teamed up with Charles Lucky Luciano, a brilliant strategist who shared his vision of a modern, business-like mafia. While Luciano built the muscle, Costello built the connections. He became the bridge between the underworld and the political elite. Judges, mayors, and police officers all found themselves in Frank's debt. He paid for their campaigns, made introductions, and fixed problems before they even knew they existed. It was corruption, yes, but it was refined corruption. He didn't bribe men, he owned them. And because of that, the police didn't see him as a criminal. They saw him as an ally. This was his genius. Costello operated quietly, keeping his name out of newspapers and his face out of police files. To the public, he was a successful businessman. To the mafia, he was the man who made everything possible. By the late 1920s, Frank Costello had become indispensable. He wasn't a soldier or a hitman, he was the diplomat. When gangs fought, he mediated. When the mafia needed political cover, he arranged it. He earned trust because he never lost control. Even in chaos, he remained calm, measured, polite, always thinking 2 steps ahead. His ability to read people and situations made him more powerful than men who ruled with guns. As his influence spread, so did his wealth. Slot machines, speakeasies, and hidden distilleries all brought in millions. But Costello's true empire wasn't made of alcohol. It was made of people. Every politician he helped, every police chief he bought, every judge he charmed, each became a piece of his invisible network. Behind the scenes, he was already shaping the future of organized crime in America. While others were fighting turf wars, Frank Costello was laying the foundation for something far greater. A unified mafia that operated like a corporation, with rules, leaders, and order. And for the first time, gangsters were beginning to realize that this quiet, well-dressed man from Harlem might be the most dangerous of them all. He didn't need to kill anyone to gain power. He only needed a conversation. It was the beginning of a transformation that would take him from the smoky back rooms of New York to the highest levels of American politics. The streets of Harlem had forged him, but what came next would make him a legend. The end of Prohibition didn't slow Frank Costello down. It elevated him. While many bootleggers lost their fortunes when alcohol became legal again, Costello had already prepared for what came next. He knew the mafia couldn't rely on one illegal trade forever. Crime had to evolve, and he would make sure it did. Alongside Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel, Costello helped create a new vision of organized crime, one that looked less like a gang and more like a corporation. Every illegal enterprise would have structure, investment, and strategy. The days of chaos were over, and Costello would be the man guiding it all from the shadows. His greatest talent wasn't violence, it was relationships. Costello cultivated friendships where others saw enemies. He built quiet alliances with judges, police chiefs, and senators, ensuring that the mafia could operate without constant interference. To the politicians he backed, Frank wasn't a criminal. He was a businessman who understood loyalty. When they needed votes, he delivered them. When they needed funding, he provided it. And when they needed silence, he bought it. He didn't just bribe individuals, he built a system of influence that reached deep into New York's power structure. It was during these years that Costello's partnership with Luciano reached its peak. Luciano wanted to reshape the mafia, turning the old Sicilian families into a national syndicate. Costello became his political brain. Together, they dismantled outdated traditions that caused endless feuds and replaced them with a governing body known as the Commission. This council, representing all the major mafia families, would settle disputes, control territories, and prevent wars. Costello was instrumental in crafting its foundation. He wasn't just a participant, he was one of its architects. While Luciano focused on maintaining peace among gangsters, Costello focused on expanding profits. He saw gambling as the future, a business that could generate steady income without the same risks as bootlegging or narcotics. With his charm and political reach, he secured gambling licenses and protection in multiple states. In New Orleans, his network of slot machines became so vast that locals referred to him as the boss of the South. In New York, he controlled hundreds of machines hidden in bars and cafes, all under the noses of authorities who pretended not to see. Costello's calm, calculating demeanor made him stand out in a world of hot-headed mobsters. He didn't yell or threaten, he negotiated. He understood psychology. When rival gangsters wanted to fight, Costello found ways to make them richer instead. His approach earned him loyalty, and something rarer in the mafia: stability. Under his guidance, the Luciano organization grew stronger, more organized, and vastly wealthier. By the late 1930s, the mafia was more than a criminal network. It was an underground empire, and Frank Costello was its ambassador. He attended social events with politicians, financed legitimate businesses, and even became friends with powerful New York figures connected to Tammany Hall, the city's infamous political machine. That alliance gave him unprecedented protection. As long as he kept the money flowing, no law enforcement agency dared to touch him. But while Costello preferred diplomacy, he wasn't naive. He knew that peace in the mafia was temporary. Envy and ambition were constant threats, and the smarter he became, the more enemies he made. Still, he thrived on staying one step ahead. He often said, "The toughest guy is the guy who can walk away." That was his philosophy. Control yourself. Control the situation. By the time World War II began, Costello was no longer just a mob figure. He was a power broker who connected the worlds of crime, business, and politics. He could pick up a phone and change the fate of an election or a judge's ruling. Newspapers whispered about a mysterious man who controlled New York from behind the scenes. They didn't know his name, but every gangster did. He was the invisible hand that made the mafia untouchable. Frank Costello had become more than a boss. He had become the mind behind the American underworld's transformation. And soon, that mind would make him the most powerful man in organized crime. By the early 1940s, Frank Costello had quietly become the most powerful mobster in America, without firing a single shot. When Lucky Luciano was imprisoned in 1936, the leadership of the mafia shifted. Instead of chaos, Costello brought stability. He took over the day-to-day operations of the Luciano crime family, but his rule looked nothing like those before him. He didn't gather soldiers in smoky rooms or scream orders across tables. He held private meetings in hotels, spoke softly, and made decisions with precision. Other bosses ruled with fear. Costello ruled with intellect. It was during this time that people began calling him the Prime Minister of the Underworld. He earned the title because of his ability to connect two worlds, the criminal and the political. His influence stretched far beyond the mafia's hierarchy. Through his deep ties with New York's Tammany Hall, he controlled judges, police commissioners, and city officials. When gangsters were arrested, charges vanished. When businesses needed licenses, they were approved overnight. Costello had built a network so powerful that politicians came to him for favors. To them, he wasn't a mobster. He was a man who could make things happen. This balance of power made Costello unique. He avoided the spotlight, rarely appearing in newspapers, and often let others take the credit. He moved money quietly, investing in legitimate ventures that hid his criminal profits. One of his biggest successes was in the gambling industry. Costello saw what others didn't. Americans loved to gamble, and the mafia could make fortunes if they kept it organized. He partnered with influential figures in New Orleans and Florida, placing thousands of slot machines in bars, clubs, and hotels. Every coin dropped into those machines sent a piece of profit back to Costello's pocket. But the gambling business was only part of his empire. He also became an early investor in Las Vegas casinos, helping lay the groundwork for what would become the mafia's biggest money-making city. He had associates everywhere, union leaders, judges, even government officials who owed him favors. It wasn't brute strength that made him powerful. It was access. Costello's phone calls carried more weight than a gun ever could. Despite his growing wealth and dominance, Costello maintained an image of sophistication. He dressed impeccably, spoke politely, and lived in an upscale Manhattan apartment rather than a guarded mansion. He wanted to appear as a gentleman, not a criminal. This calm image made him more dangerous because no one saw him coming. Even rival bosses who despised him respected his influence. They knew that without Costello, the mafia's fragile peace could collapse overnight. However, beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Vito Genovese, a ruthless and power-hungry mobster, had long coveted the position Costello now held. Genovese had been Luciano's underboss before fleeing to Italy to avoid prosecution. When he returned to the United States after the war, he expected to reclaim his old authority. But he found Costello firmly in control, and that infuriated him. Genovese believed that Costello's soft-spoken style made the family weak. He mocked Costello for avoiding violence and resented his alliances with politicians. To Genovese, the mafia was about power taken by force, not earned through charm. Slowly, he began plotting against the man who had kept the organization stable for nearly 2 decades. Costello, however, continued to focus on legitimacy. He hosted businessmen and senators, offering drinks and quiet conversations rather than threats. Yet even he knew the danger creeping closer. As the 1950s began, government investigations into organized crime intensified. The FBI and Senate were determined to expose the mafia's control over American politics. And Frank Costello, the man who had once been untouchable, was now at the center of their radar. Still, he didn't panic. He had faced worse and survived. To him, power wasn't about fear. It was about poise. Even as enemies gathered and the government closed in, Costello remained calm, confident, and deliberate. The Prime Minister of the Underworld believed that no one, not even the government, could destroy what he had built. But soon, his greatest test would come from within the mafia itself, and it would almost cost him his life. By the early 1950s, Frank Costello's quiet empire stood at its peak. He had everything: money, influence, and respect. Politicians sought his advice, mobsters sought his approval, and even the police turned a blind eye when his name was mentioned. He lived like a statesman of the underworld, holding dinner parties with judges and businessmen instead of killers and thieves. To the outside world, he was the picture of refinement. But inside the mafia, a storm was brewing. Vito Genovese, once a loyal underboss, had returned from exile with revenge in his heart. He saw Costello's diplomacy as weakness, his peacekeeping as softness. And in a world where power was measured in fear, Genovese was ready to take it all, by force if necessary. While Genovese began whispering in dark corners, Costello faced a new kind of danger from the other side of the law. In 1951, the United States Senate launched the Kefauver Committee, a televised investigation into organized crime. Millions of Americans tuned in to watch gangsters answer questions before the cameras. When Frank Costello's name appeared on the list of witnesses, it sent shockwaves across the country. He had spent decades operating in the shadows. Now, the entire nation would see his face. When Costello took the stand, he was calm but visibly irritated by the attention. The senators grilled him about his wealth, his connections, and his influence over politicians. He refused to answer anything that could incriminate him, repeating, "I respectfully decline to answer." But the moment that stuck in the public's memory wasn't his words, it was his hands. The camera focused only on them as he fidgeted, smoked, and nervously adjusted his tie. That image, those trembling hands, became the symbol of a man trying to hold his empire together while it slipped away from him. The hearings damaged Costello's reputation more than any rival ever could. To the public, he was now the face of corruption. To the mafia, he looked exposed and vulnerable. And that was exactly the moment Vito Genovese had been waiting for. Genovese began quietly gathering support within the organization, convincing old allies that Costello's time was over. Many younger gangsters agreed. They wanted a leader who ruled with fear again, not charm. Genovese promised them blood, control, and profit. By 1957, he was ready to make his move. On a spring evening that year, Costello returned to his Manhattan apartment building after dinner. As he stepped into the lobby, a man in a trench coat emerged from the shadows and shouted, "This is for you, Frank!" A gunshot echoed through the marble hall. The bullet grazed the side of Costello's head, missing his brain by mere inches. The shooter fled immediately. Costello stumbled, bleeding but alive. It was an execution attempt ordered by Genovese himself. The gunman was a young enforcer named Vincent Gigante, who would later become infamous as the Chin. When police questioned Costello in the hospital, he simply said, "I don't know who shot me. And if I did, I wouldn't tell you." That calm defiance said everything about him. He knew the Mafia's code: silence was survival. But deep down, he also knew that his era had ended. Rather than ignite a civil war, Costello made a decision that stunned everyone. He walked away. He called Genovese and told him he was retiring from the Mafia business, ending the conflict before it began. "I forgive you," he said simply. It was a line only Frank Costello could deliver, dignified, composed, and final. The assassination attempt had failed to kill him, but it had succeeded in removing him from power. The Prime Minister of the Underworld had stepped down, replaced by a man who ruled through fear and blood. Genovese may have won control, but the Mafia would never again have a leader with Costello's intelligence, restraint, or influence. And from that moment, the American Mafia began its slow descent from order to chaos. After the assassination attempt and his quiet retirement, Frank Costello became a ghost in the world he once ruled. While others fought for control, he chose peace over power, a decision that shocked both his enemies and allies. He had spent decades shaping the Mafia into a sophisticated empire, yet now he preferred the life of a recluse. His days of smoke-filled meetings, backroom deals, and secret envelopes filled with cash were over. But that didn't mean he was forgotten. To the FBI, to politicians, and even to mobsters, Costello remained a symbol of what real power looked like: control without violence, influence without chaos. In his later years, Costello spent most of his time in his luxurious Manhattan apartment and his country home in Sands Point, Long Island. He maintained a small circle of trusted friends, businessmen, lawyers, and a few old associates who respected his silence. Occasionally, he was seen dining at elegant restaurants, dressed impeccably, calm and collected as always. There was no hint of regret in his demeanor. He once told a reporter, "I've lived the way I wanted to live. Maybe I made mistakes, but I never broke my word." But the world around him was changing fast. The Mafia was no longer the tightly run empire it had been under men like Lucky Luciano and Costello. Vito Genovese's brutal reign didn't last long. He was arrested and convicted on drug trafficking charges in 1959. The power vacuum that followed created chaos within the five families. Murders, betrayals, and paranoia became the new order. The calm diplomacy of Costello's era was replaced by open war. And as the Mafia drew more attention from law enforcement, its golden age began to fade. For Costello, it was a bittersweet sight. He had warned them all: blood brings heat, and heat brings the end. He had built bridges with politicians and businessmen, not for greed, but for longevity. His philosophy had been simple: keep the peace, keep the money flowing, and keep the cops guessing. But the new generation didn't understand that kind of wisdom. They saw diplomacy as weakness. By the 1960s, the Mafia had become the FBI's prime target. The Valachi hearings exposed their inner workings to the world, and the media frenzy that followed destroyed their once secret mystique. Costello, now in his 70s, watched it all from afar, shaking his head at the arrogance of men who thought they were untouchable. "The trouble with these kids," he once remarked, "is they don't know when to stop talking." Despite his past, Costello managed to avoid spending significant time in prison. He was convicted a few times for minor charges, but he always found a way out: appeals, mistrials, or clever legal maneuvering. He had friends in all the right places, even in retirement. The same politicians who once sought his favors now avoided his name, yet many still owed him silent debts. Frank Costello died in 1973 at the age of 82 from a heart attack. No bullets, no betrayals, just the quiet end of a man who had once controlled New York's underworld. At his funeral, there were no long lines of mobsters or flashy displays of loyalty. Only a handful of close friends attended, each understanding that they were saying goodbye to the last of the old-world gangsters, the last man who ruled not through violence, but through respect. Even decades later, Costello's name commands a certain reverence in mafia history. He was the boss who wanted peace when everyone else wanted power, the criminal who moved like a politician, the man who turned the mafia from a street gang into an empire that reached the White House. In the end, Frank Costello's story isn't just about crime. It's about control, class, and legacy. While others died chasing power, he lived long enough to see the empire he built crumble without him. And in that quiet, defiant survival lies his greatest victory. For in the ruthless world of organized crime, very few men leave alive, and even fewer leave respected. But Frank Costello did both.